Hello. Good morning. This hearing will come to order. This hearing, titled Preserving the Amazon, a Shared Moral Imperative, will focus on the fires taking place in the Brazilian Amazon to highlight the global importance of the Amazon and the role we in the United States should play in helping to combat climate change and protect the rainforest. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, question, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I would like to submit a statement for the record from my friend and former colleague, Henry Waxman of California. I will now make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Good morning, and thank you for being here today as our witness on this hearing. I convened this hearing because protecting the Amazon is vital for the health of our planet. The Amazon rainforest is the most biodiverse region in the world. It contains approximately 1/5 of the world's surface freshwater supply. The water released by the Amazon's plants and rivers impacts climate trends throughout South America and can affect precipitation and the severity of droughts. The Amazon also stores billions of tons of carbon dioxide, a portion of which enters the atmosphere when deforestation occurs, potentially accelerating global climate change. For these reasons and many more, the fires currently burning in the rainforest are an issue that should concern all of us. While the fires have helped draw attention to what is happening in the Amazon, we know that they are just one symptom of the much bigger problem of deforestation. Scientists generally agree that the Amazon could reach a tipping point if current deforestation trends continue. This scenario would jeopardize the many benefits the Amazon provides our climate and would threaten millions of plants and animal species the rainforest ecosystem supports. The goal of this hearing is to understand the causes and scope of the problem and explore solutions to preserve the Amazon. Today, we will hear expert analysis of Brazil's environmental protection policies, challenges to their implementation, and recommendation about what more needs to be done. I deeply value our relationship with Brazil and appreciate the Brazilian government's historical commitment to balancing its promotion of economic development with efforts to preserve the environment. In looking for a path to success, we can look to Brazil's recent past. From 2005 to 2014, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon declined by over 70%. During the same period, the Brazilian economy grew and nearly 30 million people were lifted out of poverty. In other words, well-regulated economic development efforts have gone hand in hand with successful environmental protection programs in the past. There is no reason why this cannot be achieved again. I believe the United States has a role to play in supporting Brazil on this issue, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work together in fulfilling our global leadership role. We must also support the indigenous communities that live in the Amazon, whose right to live on their ancestral lands for generations to come depends on the health of the rainforest. Preserving the Amazon isn't just the right thing to do. This is an issue that directly affects our own constituents because the health of the Amazon rainforest ultimately impacts the water we drink and the air we breathe. Unfortunately, the United States cannot be a leader in the environmental if we do not return to policies of acknowledging the scientific reality of global climate change. I strongly criticize the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, not only because it ignored overwhelming scientific evidence, but also because it has undermined our credibility on the world stage and hurt our national security interests. This should not be This should not be a partisan issue. If we do not take the threat of climate change seriously, our children and grandchildren will never forgive us for failing to meet the moral demand of our time. Today, I look forward to a bipartisan discussion about how the United States Congress can advocate the necessary policies to combat climate change and work with the Brazilian government to protect the Amazon. Thank you, and I now turn to Ranking Member Rooney for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ceres. I think this hearing on the shared moral imperative of the Amazon is very important. The media is focused on the Amazon in recent weeks because of the fires there. The fires have broadened public awareness of the unique ecological importance of the region and its global impact. I personally have spent much time there. I've traversed it from Iquitos, Peru, to Manaus, Brazil, and have navigated the Napo in Ecuador. In Brazil, the Amazon biome constitutes 2.1 million square miles of rainforest, 40% of the world's. So the world has a vested interest in preserving the Amazon rainforest. It contains nearly 1/2 of the world's carbon, which is in many ways an essential defense against global climate change. Recent concerns over deforestation and fire hotspots in the Amazon are legitimate and credible. However, this year's number of fires registers as the 8th highest in the last 20 years, and 2018's was the 12th highest. While not the highest number of fires and hectares of deforestation, they're still unacceptable. The governments of the region have the responsibility to enforce the laws and take the necessary measures to preserve the Amazon. Laws and regulations enacted by Brazil since 2004 have reduced deforestation and placed regulations on legal burning and land clearing practices. Within the Amazon biome, private property owners are mandated to conserve at least 80% of their land's native vegetation. Further, Brazil's commitment to the 2009 Copenhagen Agreement has reduced deforestation by 73% since its peak in 2004. That's a 2.28 gigaton reduction in CO2 emissions. Brazil has also invested in monitoring technology and databases to detail events in the Amazon, while also investing in renewable resources to achieve 45% usage of renewable energy. Further, just last week, leaders from Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, and Suriname held a regional summit in Colombia to discuss regional measures to protect the Amazon. The United States and the international community must also work with these countries to advance conservation of the Amazon rainforest. The United States provided over $20 million in foreign aid assistance for natural resource and biodiversity conservation in 2017 and 2018, and created the Partnership for Conservation of the Amazon Biodiversity Program, which conserves the Amazon through management, monitoring of protected areas. It also considers the critical role of the private sector in developing public-private partnerships aimed at conservation and sustainability for existing communities within the Amazon. Through USAID, the Forest Service works with the Brazilian government on sustainable forest management and biodiversity. In fiscal year 2019, Congress appropriated $11 million through USAID to be used for environmental programs. International cooperation is essential to preserving the Amazon rainforest, but will only be effective if the host governments are committed to meeting conservation goals. As a representative from Southwest Florida, whose district includes the Everglades, I have a thorough understanding of the importance of preserving our watersheds. Data shows that what happens in the Amazon affects us in Florida and throughout the United States, from rain patterns in the Midwest to the sargassum grass washing up on the beaches in the Caribbean, Cancun, and the Gulf of Mexico now, and the algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. These blooms, which severely threaten tourism-based economies in Florida and the other coastal areas, are partly caused by nutrient runoff from the Amazon. I will continue to work with my colleagues in Congress, as well as international partners and the Brazilian government, to seek reduced burning, reduced deforestation, and reduced outflow of polluted water through the Amazon watershed. I look forward to hearing the testimonies and opinions of our important witnesses today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Rooney. I will now introduce Dr. Monica Duvall. Is that right? She is the director of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Latin American Program and holds the Rayburn Chair at Johns Hopkins. She is also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. She previously worked as the director for the Institute for Economic Policy Research in Brazil and as an economist at the International Monetary Fund. She holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. Welcome. We will then hear from Dr. Dan Neff. The president and founder of the Earth Innovation Institute. Mr. Neff has worked in the Brazilian Amazon for more than 30 years, publishing over 160 papers and books on regional ecology and public policy. Before founding the Earth Innovation Institute, he was a senior scientist at Woods Hole Research Center, a lecturer at Yale University, and co-founder of the Amazon Environmental Research Institute. He was also a lead author of the 5th assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He holds a PhD in forest ecology from Yale University. Thank you for being here. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Bill Milan. Milan. Okay, I apologize, Mr. Milan. Lo siento mucho. Let me start all over again. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Bill Milan, Chief Conservation Officer and Director of Policy at the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. Previously, Mr. Milan was a career Foreign Service officer for over 20 years. He served in U.S. embassies in Colombia and Venezuela and worked as a political counselor at the U.S. mission to the Organization of American States. He is a U.S. Army veteran and earned 2 Bronze Stars in Vietnam. He received his master's degree from the University of Virginia. Thank you for your service and for joining us here today. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Duvall, it's now your turn.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It is my distinct honor to testify before you today on how Brazil and the United States should work together to preserve the Amazon rainforest. Mr. Chairman, my remarks this morning will summarize my submitted written testimony. Global warming is widely and correctly blamed for wildfires around the world, but the Amazon fires in Brazil represent a more specific government policy failure, as Brazilian public agencies that are supposed to curb man-made fires have been deliberately weakened. These fires set by farmers, cattle growers, and others take place every year, but they have risen in number and severity in 2019. After President Jair Bolsonaro took office, he set about fulfilling his campaign pledge to ease environmental, land use, and health regulations. The Amazon fires are not just a tragedy, but an opportunity for the governments of Brazil and the United States to stop denying climate change and cooperate on strategies to preserve the rainforest and develop ways to sustainably use its natural resources. The record of such cooperation has already yielded positive results. For example, there is a history of collaboration between NASA and Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, employing state-of-the-art technologies to monitor deforestation. It is possible to accommodate competing demands of economic interests, food security, and saving or even restoring the Amazon rainforest, along with its life-sustaining rainfall for Brazil and the world at large. Following are the major policy recommendations presented in this testimony. The United States should rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and immediately establish a joint action plan with Brazil to implement steps to preserve and restore the rainforest. Under the Paris Agreement, Brazil has committed to restoring 12 million hectares of native vegetation in cleared areas. Brazil should impose greater regulations on land use in the Amazon that would allow farming and cattle grazing in some areas to sustain livelihoods of local and indigenous people, while cracking down on illegal uses such as logging and mining and the invasion of public lands. To combat destructive activities, the government should encourage livestock rearing and cultivation in non-sensitive areas, while more systematically demarcating land and property ownership rights in the rainforest itself. Brazil should lead an international effort to foster the diversity of native vegetation in the Amazon region, while preserving the rainforest and also creating jobs and reducing poverty and income inequality, which plague the region. Sustainable production of livestock and soy is already happening in areas outside the Amazon. These activities could be expanded to areas adjacent to the rainforest following an effort to demarcate land and enforce property rights. The international community should work with Brazil to revive and expand the Amazon Fund, created years ago, but now in limbo, to raise international donations for investment in sustainable activities that protect the rainforest. The fund would greatly benefit from the financial support of the United States. Technical cooperation agreements to develop new technologies for sustainable development are a must. Finally, the Brazilian Constitution allows the economic exploration of indigenous lands in cooperation with local communities and with a focus on sustainability. However, use of these lands is yet to be formalized through adequate regulation. The United States, with its experience in formulating and applying similar regulations, can play a key role in advising the Brazilian government on such roles. The rise in deforestation precedes President Bolsonaro's electoral victory, but the dismantling of environmental agencies under his watch and his past and present rhetoric on environmental issues have emboldened farmers, loggers, and other players to engage in predatory behavior in the rainforest. It is time for the international community to cooperate on a strategy to provide the resources to conserve, restore, and develop the planet's largest continuous rainforest. The close relationship that has developed between the leaders of Brazil and the United States should be used to jumpstart this effort before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Dr. Neff.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Cirrus, and it is a real honor to be here to give this testimony. I'll give a brief summary of my written submitted testimony. I moved to the Amazon in 1984 to begin my doctoral research. It was a Wild West town of Paragominas. One thing I learned there is that we tend to think of frontier towns as full of bandits and land grabbers. That place was full of families from across Brazil trying to improve their lot in life. I think that observation is still relevant today, the need to not demonize the people of the Amazon. The Amazon is important, as Ranking Member Rooney already mentioned, largely because of its role in the global climate system. There's 7 or 8 years worth of global emissions of carbon stored in the trees of the Amazon, and if those come out, that carbon comes out rapidly, it really diminishes the likelihood that humanity will avoid catastrophic climate change. But there's also an effect on global circulation patterns through the amount of water that's evaporated from Amazon trees. That's enough water, enough conversion of solar energy into water vapor to influence global circulation patterns, much the way an El Niño event, a warming of the East Pacific surface waters, shapes rainfall patterns around the world. The current situation is dire but not unprecedented. Deforestation is up. Currently estimated about 6,000 square kilometers against a historical average of 20,000 square kilometers per year, that average through 2005. But it is higher than last year, perhaps 40 or 50%, and it is certainly a cause for concern. There are a lot of fires, but as already been mentioned, this is not an unprecedented high year for fires, highest since 2010. And these two phenomena are related. Many of the fires today are persistent fires in the same position. That means they're burning little patches or large patches of felled forests where the trees have been dried for months and can now be set fire. That means that there's a lot of smoke coming out of the Amazon, and that's creating tens of thousands of internments and respiratory ailments and deaths because of smoke inhalation. Intact forests, all of the available evidence suggests that they are not burning at scale. So forests that have neither been logged nor previously burned, and this is very good news. It's not a severely dry year, and this is a cause for concern. We need to be watching for those forests and make sure that if they start to catch fire, there are teams on the ground ready to spot them and put them out, because they're actually quite easy to put out, fires in intact forests. That is part of the Amazon dieback scenario referred to by the chairman. A big part of that is wildfires, basically, well, man-made fires escaping into intact forests. In 1998, 40,000 square kilometers of forest, standing forest, caught fire. And once it burns, a forest is more likely to burn again. And that, together with the fact that the Amazon forest generates much of its own rainfall, come together in this Amazon forest dieback scenario. And we may be close to the tipping point, the minimum, the area of deforestation beyond which that downward spiral begins. Finally, as to the U.S. response, I want to call attention to what I feel in my many decades, years working in Brazil, is a frustration in the Brazilian government, in Brazilian nationally, in state governments, and among farm sectors, that Brazil has done its part in climate change. There was a promise coming out of Copenhagen that there would be a robust international mechanism for compensating that contribution, and that has not come through. Of the approximately 7 billion tons of emissions reductions achieved through reduced deforestation in the Amazon, about 3% of that has been compensated through Norwegian and German contributions to the Amazon Fund and direct contracts, pay-for-performance contracts with the states of Mato Grosso and Acre in the Amazon region. There is, as referred to by Ranking Member Rooney, a very high bar for farmers. That has not been always the case. It jumped from 50 to 80, back to 50. There's a concern among farmers that the legal compliance that they're striving to achieve is not recognized. I think we're in the middle of a very strong backlash from the farm sector because of that failure to recognize how difficult it is to comply with the law there. I think moving forward, this is not a time to back out of trade agreements. It's a time to stay in trade agreements, processes, and send a signal that if Brazil continues its historical march towards reducing deforestation, there will be real benefits, and we need to monetize those benefits, as was done about 11 years ago, nearly, by this House. I think I'm out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Milan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the others, I will submit my statement for the record and talk briefly, extemporaneously on top of that statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Rooney and other members of the committee. When I left diplomatic service, I began working in conservation, something I've now done for 20 years. I worked for many years in the international programs of the Nature Conservancy, which of course is very active in Brazil and the other countries of that region, and for the last 4 years at the International Conservation Caucus Foundation, which acts as the secretariat for a caucus of members of this Congress, about 170 members of the House and Senate who are interested in and supportive of U.S. support and activism for conservation in the poor countries of the world, the developing countries of the world. Internationally, ICCF has created similar caucuses in about 12 foreign countries, and we're hoping to grow further in the near future. We're in Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. We're in 9 countries of Africa, and we're hoping to expand into Indonesia and the Caribbean island states starting next month. With regard to the Amazon, as the other speakers have noted, this is by far the world's largest tropical forest. About 90% of it is rainforest. About 20% of the original forest is already gone. Deforestation often occurs in stages. Where the lumber is valuable, the loggers will clear cut. Would-be ranchers then come in and burn the slash that's left behind in order to clear the land for grazing. And later, if the soil is suitable with modern fertilizers and methods, it may be converted to field crops such as soybeans. Deforestation is, of course, not unique to Brazil. It has also been high in neighboring Paraguay and Bolivia, and in regions of Peru and Colombia. During the period of 1960 to 2010, the population of the Amazon basin rose from 6 million to 25 million persons, many of them engaged in agriculture. This has inevitably had an effect. Deforestation of the Amazon in Brazil peaked at around 2005, as you noted, Mr. Chairman. It subsequently dropped by about 70%. While market forces may have played some role in this decline, it was not mirrored in other countries of the basin, which suggests that better enforcement of Brazilian laws, which, for example, mandated that private landowners had to keep a percentage of their Amazon land in forest, and which forbade intrusions into protected areas, better enforcement of those laws was the major cause. And better enforcement ultimately depends upon political will. It depends upon the top leadership of the country taking conservation and good management of natural resources seriously. People, of course, have a right to develop their natural resources, and that right is probably clearest when the people are poor. Brazil is a modern, high-productivity country with a population equal to that of France, 60-some-odd million, but the actual total population is 211 million. So Brazil has a highly unequal distribution of income, and it has a large population of poorly educated small farmers and ranchers who are eager to take advantage of what they are told is free land and better jobs, and many large ranchers and farmers eager to employ them in defiance of national laws. It is especially painful to note that 15% of the Amazon is reserved by law for Indian tribes, and if those laws are weakened or not enforced, their fate, which is already difficult, is likely to get worse. The situation of the Brazilian Amazon and neighboring countries of the basin is a complex one that involves balancing many competing interests, many of them legitimate. It is unlikely to be resolved purely by outside pressures. A growth of political will to properly manage their own national resources will be vital. Progress over the coming years and decades will likely be uneven and will sometimes be reversed. But we have to try, we have to keep trying. U.S. foreign assistance can play an important role in that struggle. I recall a study done by my colleagues at the Nature Conservancy when I worked there, when they said that we needed to increase world agricultural production by 100% by shortly after 2050. But to do that by expanding the land under cultivation would mean essentially the destruction of the entire natural world around the globe. But we could do it by raising productivity on existing lands. The meaning of this for the Amazon boils down to this. Cutting down the Amazon forest is not needed for the future agricultural production of the world. The existing forest is needed for a host of other benefits. We urge the Congress to continue, as it has in the past, to support that goal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now go to questions. I'll start by asking, I made a statement before that from 2004 to 2012, cattle and soy production in Brazil rose. The economy grew, nearly 30 million Brazilians were lifted out of poverty, and deforestation rates declined. Can you tell me what policies were implemented during that time that was so successful? Anybody? What?
If I may?
Yes.
So the Brazilian government in 2004 implemented an action plan to reduce deforestation, given that it had been on the rise in previous decades. This plan was a broad umbrella of many different initiatives to fight off deforestation, including through monitoring and law enforcement. So there was a lot of coordination between two major environmental agencies in Brazil, the National Space Agency that I've already mentioned, and also IBAMA, which is the agency responsible for monitoring and for law enforcement. These two agencies were working in close cooperation. Satellite imagery systems developed with NASA were incorporated into these efforts. And alongside the monitoring and the law enforcement capabilities that were put in place, there were also other policies. So for example, in 2008, the Brazilian Central Bank actually passed a resolution whereby it restricted credit greatly to areas where deforestation had been on the rise. Rural credit in Brazil is subsidized, so a lot of those farmers did depend heavily on those credits. And those credits were then conditioned on meeting several different environmental regulations. If they were not in compliance, if these farmers were not in compliance with these regulations, they did not get access to the credit. There are several studies, several academic and empirical studies showing that that policy in itself was hugely successful in bringing down deforestation in 36 municipalities in the Amazon, where that had been previously a problem. So the tools, the capabilities, the initiatives, there are a number of things that have been tested and tried, some of them with great success, some of them perhaps with lesser success. But broadly, I would say that Brazil knows what to do. There is an issue of political will at the moment.
Yes.
Just to add very briefly to that, in our summary of those policies that we published in Science a few years ago, our conclusion is that it was largely a set of command and control interventions that were lacking carrots. So part of the reason deforestation has been coming up beginning in 2012 is that a lot of those measures that were referred to by Monica have lost their teeth, and there's a lack of that positive set of incentives for farmers and state governments, too, that are doing the right thing.
Thank you. I would endorse the comments by Monica that it is possible to grow the economy rapidly without doing grave damage to the conservation of nature and natural resources. What it requires is taking a long-term perspective, and it takes good governance and a well-managed public authority.
One concern that I have is I see that China is now getting involved in buying a lot of the soybean that they're not purchasing from us. Do you think that's going to make the situation worse, since now 80% of the soybeans made in Brazil basically are going to China? Do you think that's going to drive deforestation? Anybody?
I think in the short term, the large-scale slaughter of swine in China because of African fever is really reducing the demand for animal ration, but it's increasing demand for pork. So I think in a few years, as that crisis passes, there is a very high risk that rising demand for soybeans could accelerate deforestation. A lot of it depends upon whether or not those incentives to soy farmers are in place, whether or not the current momentum to dismantle the forest code that requires 80% forest cover on soy farms in the Amazon moves forward. And I think that will depend upon whether markets give a positive signal that they recognize legal compliance with the forest code as a very high bar of performance on the ground. And so I think a lot is in play right now. Brazilian farmers have lots of options for markets, but we have to remember that a positive market signal, including from the U.S. for example, Brazilian beef, is seen as a carrot. It's one of the carrots that can be mobilized without invoking large flows of new finance.
Mr. Chairman, my colleagues on the China desk of olden days would not appreciate my bluntness, but I think that the massive entry of China into these markets is not a good thing. We've talked about the importance of good governance. I think that as a government, the Chinese government simply does not take many of these environmental issues very seriously, particularly not when it is outside China. So, for example, 10 or 15 years ago, they enforced a nationwide ban on cutting down any further forest inside China and decided to instead cut down Indonesia.
Let me add, if I may, to my colleagues' remarks, just to say that the environmental seal for the agribusiness sector in Brazil, and in particular beef, but not just beef, soybeans as well, has been, until recently, hugely important for exports. There is a very large chunk of the sector which is geared towards exports. And one of the very important roles that the international community at large, and the United States in particular, can play is in ensuring that that seal remains as an incentive for this sector, this portion of the sector, to continue with its sustainable production practices, and thus sort of staving off any kind of pressure coming potentially from the Chinese.
Thank you. Congressman Rooney.
I'd like to thank all three witnesses for their testimony. Very thorough. I'd like to ask Mr. Milan first and then Mr. Nepstad about the absence of land titles in the Amazon and the economic interest of the landowners, being kind of a free enterprise kind of guy. You know, Mr. Milan mentions that the 70% decline in deforestation since 2005 may have something to do with economic factors, and that there's an asymmetry between what's happened there with the decline and enforcement of laws there versus what's happened in neighboring countries. I assume you mean Paraguay and Bolivia. So how does the increase in titling and enforcement of laws relate to these statistics, and what can that tell us about going forward?
Congressman Rooney, I will defer to Monica about some of the technical economic aspects here. I think the decline of deforestation inside Brazil clearly was driven mainly by better enforcement of their laws rather than by market factors. Across Latin America, the lack of clear title to land is a terribly grave issue. When I worked at the Nature Conservancy, we had a program in Basawas in Nicaragua where we worked for 5 or 6 years, and we finally were able to help an Indian community there to get what seemed to be a firm title to their land. I was told laughingly in Guatemala that in the entire history of the country, only 10 absolute titles to land had ever been issued. We're talking about legal systems that function very poorly, and they're particularly bad at recognizing legal title. And so the result is that for many people, by far the easiest way to acquire a large ranch is to steal it. And this is a bad thing. Some of these countries need to reform their land title laws, but then having reformed them, they will then need the political will to actually carry out the new provisions.
Mr. Nepstad?
There has been huge steps forward with law enforcement in Brazil under the PPCD-AM strategy that Dr. Duvall referred to. One of the risks, though, is that in getting to law enforcement, and one of the fundamental tools of that approach is the Rural Environmental Cadastre or Registry, the CAR. Every landholder under the new Forest Code of 2012 is required to submit their own map of their property. Unfortunately, they've come in and there's a lot of overlap, surprise, surprise. But the risk is that in focusing on law enforcement, the CAR is not a land title. You neglect the very fundamental role of land as a guarantee against loans. Farmers today in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, have a hard time getting loans with their property as collateral if they're mostly forested. Land values increase as forests go down. So we have this fundamental economic disconnect where if you take the EPA social cost of carbon, a hectare of forest, that carbon out of the atmosphere is saving the world economy $50,000. But if I'm a landholder and I have that same hectare of forest, it's worth to me $200. If I clear it, its value multiplies by 10. And I can't use the forest land as collateral. So I think that's, you've identified a fundamental gap that moving forward, as Brazil moves to a strategy that continues the sticks, but adds some carrots, getting to land title is a crucial piece of that.
So I fully agree with Dr. Nepstad's assessment and overview of what he's just said about the sort of market incentives, economic incentives at play. I will just add one thing from the past experience under the PPCD-AM, the National Action Plan of 2004. Alongside these actions that I mentioned that the central bank put in place to restrict credit and thereby, just put in place a mechanism whereby credit was conditioned to meeting the environmental standards that had to be met, there was a clear effort to put together a land registry of these areas within the Amazon biome. So again, these efforts have been now sort of fallen by the wayside. They are things that could again be implemented, and there are things that could again be implemented on a much larger scale. So there is the potential to do these things again, and there is the potential to achieve the sort of successes that were achieved back in the mid-2000s through these policies by greatly enlarging what has previously been done.
Referring to the past policies, it's a pretty bad deal when the property value goes up with more deforestation. That's kind of working against what we want to have happen. The requirement of 80% property staying in preservation, first of all, will that be, you have any confidence that will be enforced and will have an impact? And if it were impacted, how would that improve things and improve that asymmetry between value and deforestation?
Well, on the 80%, the 80% has, over the last few years, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think over the last few years has already been somewhat softened. So in a way, it's not being enforced as such, including because the 80% requirement that you do not touch that area of your own property to produce and retain it as native vegetation is very, very hard to comply with. So there has to be something else being done with the legislation in agreement overall as to what's best for the region in terms of meeting these requirements or even lowering these requirements in certain cases. As for the current situation, which is that, cleared land is worth more than forested land, which basically leads to all sorts of speculation as we have been seeing, it's a matter of designing the proper regulations and the proper incentive structure that makes that equation shift the other way. So this is what we're looking at. This is what Brazil needs. Brazil needs to get the regulations right so that it shifts that balance.
Thank you. Thank you,
Just
Chairman.
to add to that, yeah, so the 80% is fairly new. Until 1996, 50% of the property in the Amazon had to remain as forest cover. I think one of the most significant actions that could take place today would be a public recognition of the importance of those private land reserves and recognition of the need to compensate farmers who are being asked to forego their legal right to clear forests in excess of that 80%. That is the farmers' current complaint, for example, about the Brazilian soy moratorium, where 90% of the soy buyers for the Amazon said after 2008, if you cleared after that date, we will not buy your soy grown on that land. And the farmer's response is, but wait a minute, I'm in legal compliance and I have the legal right, what about me? And that concern is gotten particularly grave as that same approach is under discussion for the Cerrado savanna biome next to the Amazon. So it's a very big issue.
Thank you. Congressman Levin.
Thank you so much, Chairman Series, for calling this really important hearing on short order and getting these tremendous witnesses. This is really great, and I appreciate all of your testimony. I want to try to focus on what we can do with U.S. policy to be helpful to this very difficult situation. Dr. Duvall, you mentioned in your testimony that the economic benefit of conservation far outweighs the short-term gains from cutting down the forest and then setting it ablaze after it's been dried out. Is there a role for the United States to play in encouraging conservation in Brazil and making clear that it's more sound economic policy than deforestation? How can we really get at that?
Well, thank you for that question. I think there are a couple of ways. One is through the current mechanism that exists, so the Amazon Fund. The Amazon Fund is already there. We need to just properly redesign, perhaps rethink what its role should be, and therefore, what kind of financial resources it needs. So that kind of financial assistance from the U.S., I think, would be crucial. There are other things in the area of regulation, sustainable cattle grazing, land demarcation for indigenous lands, and not only that, but how do you actually exploit indigenous lands? Some of the things that I've mentioned in my oral remarks, but also in my written testimony, where the U.S. has had ample experience and where that experience can certainly be transferred to Brazil. So there's a lot of room for technical cooperation on a number of these issues.
Okay, great. Let's talk about one area of our relations, which is trade. Both President Trump and President Bolsonaro seem interested in growing the trade relationship between the U.S. and Brazil. So how should the U.S. insist on strong environmental commitments from Brazil before expanding trade between our countries? For example, last month, BBC reported that Brazil had seriously relaxed its enforcement of environmental laws that are already on the books. And I'm quoting here from the BBC account, official data from Brazil's environmental agency shows that fines from January to the 23rd of August dropped almost a third compared with the same period of last year. And at the same time, the number of fires burning in Brazil have increased by 84%, and as you all testified, the highest since 2010. And I've heard direct testimony from people there saying, hey, it's the Wild West now. The president obviously is giving us the green light to go ahead here. So how can the U.S. demand that Brazil commit to stricter enforcement of the environmental laws already there, and any other ideas you all have to how we should use our trading relationship with Brazil to preserve the Amazon?
Well, I think the U.S. should use its leverage on that front. The Brazilian government is greatly interested in pursuing some kind of bigger trade agreement with the U.S., whether that becomes an actual, free trade agreement or not, that's years in the making, but certainly closer trade relations. And those closer trade relations, that conversation in itself can be used to leverage, for the U.S. to leverage and try to enforce some of these regulations that are not being met. So that can certainly be achieved through negotiations, which the Brazilian government is very much open to at this point.
I would just add that I think we're in a very volatile time in Brazil where unilateral actions that threaten market retaliations, restrictions to trade, I believe they'll backfire. I think it's time for sitting down at the table and saying, recognizing that managing a continental-sized forest like the Amazon is a phenomenal task. It's very expensive. Brazil did what no one thought was possible, and now it's time to recognize that and say how we can help. Part of this is that Brazil is no wonder 109th on the ease of doing business ranking of the World Bank, and the Amazon is much worse than that. It's really hard to do investments, to do enterprise in the Amazon. I think the U.S. has a lot to offer in that sort of collaboration through the GDA and other mechanisms of the USAID. But I think this collaborative approach that says, listen, we will open to whatever, Amazon beef, if these conditions are in place and we see some progress. What Norway did in the Amazon Fund is say, you build a system, if deforestation comes down, the payments will flow. And $1 billion later, a little more than $1 billion later, I think that was a very positive thing to do. The way it was structured was probably not right. That money did not make it to middle and large-scale farmers, for example, and they're wondering why they've been left out. So, in short, collaboration, keep the negotiations going, and weave the conditions into that.
Thank you. My time's expired, but I would just observe, Mr. Chairman, that the investment we need to make to tackle the grave crisis of climate change for the United States and the world is so immense. It seems that this would be it would be penny-wise and pound-foolish not to work with Brazil very intensively on the efforts that our panelists are suggesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Tejoho.
Thank you, Mr. Sorry, my microphone didn't go on. To find what they want to do with their natural resources that is compatible with, I guess, world standards. How successful are the bans on crops on deforested land by other countries? Have you seen? Dr. Nebstead, you were talking about that. What's your experience? You've been down in the Amazon a long time.
When threats come from the EU, the first response is, oh, this is protectionism, and they're protecting their own markets, and that point was made abundantly about President Macron's threat to pull out of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. We have to remember that 60% of agricultural exports from Brazil go to Asia. China, as already mentioned, is the biggest supporter, and currently Asian markets are not demanding sustainability or deforestation-free sourcing. And so I think that Asia will move in that direction. Xi Jinping is keenly interested in solving climate change and keenly interested in investing in the Amazon. So something like the Ferrogrão Railroad is something that could buy goodwill in Brazil, give soy farmers a big break in transport if it's structured right, and everyone comes out winning.
I wish I had your confidence on Xi Jinping. I'm more in line with Mr. Milan. In Brazil, we know they're the largest cattle exporter in the world, but yet between 1990 and 2018, Brazil beef production increased 139%, while the areas of cattle grazing decreased 15%. And if you look at it in America, we're producing a third more beef with a third less of the land that we use. And knowing that best management practices on our farmlands, we know that grasslands, according to a study in UC Davis that is titled "Grasslands More Reliable Carbon Sinks Than Trees," and I'm not implying they're more efficient, but they store their carbon underground along with other things like nitrogens and sulfurs and things like that, that when a forest burns, that's not released into the atmosphere, so therefore it's sequestered more securely. With the best practice managements, those are things that I think there's a trade-off. So if you cut down 100 acres of rainforest, which is a shame because we've all been there and seen that, and we know what that biodiversity gives to the world, and the National Geographic specials, we can offset that by a certain amount of rangeland. Would that be true?
I think there's tremendous scope for improvements in the productivity of cattle, especially in the Amazon. 50 kilos of beef per hectare per year is not an efficient system. And as you say, the beef production outside of the Amazon in Brazil is growing on a shrinking area of pasture. I think the net balance on greenhouse gases because of enteric fermentation is this very serious issue that can be partially compensated by good grazing.
Let me go back to something that the EPA said. The U.S. EPA said estimates direct emission from U.S. beef industry are only 1.9% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So I know there's a lot of emphasis on beef cattle as far as greenhouse gas emissions, but I think it's maybe not accurate as it could be. And I think we need to look at that because for sustainability of protein and food sources, we have to have that kind of juggling of which is the best way to go. And with the world population growing stronger, or going to 9 billion to 10 billion, we have to have sustainable agricultural practices, and it goes back to best managed practices practices that we do. Going back to the deforestation, there has to be a market for those trees, where that lumber is going. What country is the biggest importer of illegal deforested areas? Is anybody?
Well, the largest market for illegally harvested woods is China, has been for 20 years.
I was going to say, I think it's a 5-letter name with a C and an
yes.
A in it.
Yes, but I don't know if any of it to speak of comes from Brazil. Perhaps one of my colleagues has better information than I do. A lot of it comes from Malaysia, it comes from Indonesia, it comes from Burma, comes from Madagascar, Mozambique, but I hadn't heard about Brazil.
Well, I haven't either, so I have no direct answer to that. But one thing that I will say about what happens to the trees that are cut down, in order to be able to clear the land for pastures, this is a rainforest that we're talking about, so you need to dry out the rainforest first.
Right.
So the way that that's done is that the trees are cut, so the trunks go dry, and then after you do that, you set it ablaze. So to a large extent, we're talking about logging activities that, take place. Probably some of that goes, to the region itself. Brazil is a big country, so a lot of it probably goes into the construction sector in Brazil. It's all very opaque, so we don't have the data on that to say something, But I would say that most of it probably is internal and goes to the internal construction sector. And the rest of it is just wasted, and it's just meant to clear land.
All right, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Rooney, and to each of you, our witnesses, grateful for your time today. I'm hoping to connect some dots, just starting with some yes and no questions. The primary drivers of deforestation in the Amazon are cattle ranching, logging, and large-scale agriculture. Is that correct, each of you? I'd love yes or no answers, if you could.
Yes, absolutely.
President Bolsonaro, before he was elected, made statements concerning his intent to pursue development in the region. Is that correct?
Yes.
Before his election, President Bolsonaro also repeatedly pledged to relax environmental regulations and environment and open up indigenous territories and protected areas to mining, agriculture, and large-scale energy projects. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So do you believe it's a coincidence that President Bolsonaro was elected last year with the support of Brazil's powerful agricultural lobby? Coincidence or no?
I haven't seen any polling data one way or the other. I really can't say that definitively.
Doctor?
He was supported by the farm sector. Yeah, certainly.
He was supported by the farm sector. I, however, think that the farm sector now, at least a portion of the farm sector, and we have seen that happen, is quite aware, keenly aware, that they will lose their international standing and they will lose their green seal, so to speak, if they continue to support the kind of measures that Bolsonaro has been putting in place. So they are a potential political force in Brazil that can be exploited to produce the results that we'd like to see in terms of, the environmental scale back that we've seen under Bolsonaro.
Doctor, can you talk about any efforts to that end that might exist right now?
So there have been a few. It's not a lot of voices as of the moment, but there have been a few important agribusiness people, in particular one who was a former agricultural minister and is one of the largest soybean growers in Brazil, Mr. Blairo Maggi, who has made some very important remarks regarding how hurtful the scaling back of environmental regulations has been so far for Brazil, and the potential that could be even more hurtful down the road. So there have been voices like that, which are important not just from the productive sector side, but from the political side as well, because they're voices that have been in government that are starting to see that this can be hugely detrimental to their own interests.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Milan, we know there are indigenous and local communities in Brazil that are living and working sustainably in the forest. You spoke of laws in place in these communities. Can you expand on the current enforcement of these very laws?
My direct experience of the programs there is now some years in the past, and so I wouldn't want to try to comment on the details of recent changes. Brazil has hundreds of separate Indian tribes, most of which speak a unique language, and many of which do not have a single member of the tribe who's graduated from the equivalent of high school. So these are intensely vulnerable communities that desperately need outside help to organize and defend their rights. Theoretically, under the law, they have a lot of rights, but actually making them effective against the pressure of illegal miners and other invaders of their territory for agriculture or otherwise is and has been terribly difficult.
Any organizations at the forefront of assisting them in that effort?
My colleagues?
Groups like Instituto Socioambiental, I think, are very concerned with the wave of impunity, I think, that is present in the Amazon right now, and impunity growing out of frustration for the lack of positive incentives and recognition for past efforts and successes. So it's a very volatile moment, and there are signs that deforestation patches are increasing within protected areas and indigenous territories.
Okay. President Trump has characterized President Bolsonaro as, quote, a like-minded leader, end quote. He's announced several agreements to bolster economic and security ties with Brazil, and also opposed the aid package, of course, for the fires during the G7, and instead publicly praised Bolsonaro for, quote, working very hard on the Amazon fires and in all respects doing a great job for the people of Brazil, end quote. Do you believe, each of you, considering these statements, that President Trump is helping or hurting the crisis unfolding in the Amazon? Helping or hurting?
At the moment, not helping.
Doctor?
I think that's, I sense that you want really fast questions, and I think there's a lot of nuance to this question. As I said before, I think unilateral sort of threats of retaliation against Brazil right now could backfire. And I don't support a lot of what's going on in Brazil right now, but I do know the roots of it. And I think a positive signal on trade from the United States, for example, could go a long way. So.
Thank you, Doctor. And Mr. Milan.
And I would suggest that as we go forward on these issues, which, as I commented in my remarks, are difficult and complex, and they involve not just legitimate interests against illegitimate, but direct competitions between interests that are inherently legitimate in and of themselves. These are terribly difficult issues that are going to be, were not going to be resolved this year, next year, or in 5 years. I think that to the extent that private groups can be involved, not only as investors, but also as consumers and as associations of consumers. You see this a lot in Europe, and you see it to a certain extent here already in the United States. That brings another interesting player to the table, because now it isn't just a big country appearing to bully a developing world country. It's groups of hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of consumers saying, we won't buy your stuff if you do bad things in order to create it. And striking that balance, of course, is always going to be complicated, but I think that sort of action has a lot of potential.
Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. And I apologize that I came in late and missed some of the conversation. I was at another meeting. But I think everybody would agree that the Amazon forest is important to the health of the region and the health of the world. And I guess my question is, in your own assessment, how strong are the efforts of Bolsonaro's government to protect the Amazon? Do you believe that he and his administration are doing everything they can to protect the Amazon?
As I submitted in my written testimony and as I mentioned in my oral remarks, the answer to that is no. He has scaled back the capabilities of the environmental agencies in Brazil. He has scaled back monitoring efforts. He has scaled back law enforcement. He has spoken specifically about, using the Amazon's resources and not necessarily in a sustainable way. He has not underscored sustainability in any of his remarks. So that really has emboldened a lot of predatory behavior in the rainforest more recently. Does he have the tools to do what he needs to do? Does he have the capabilities within these agencies and within ministries in Brazil, and also going from past experience in Brazil in terms of what has been done? The answer to that is yes. But the ultimate question here is a question of political will.
Sure. Do either of you significantly disagree with that answer? Or let me ask it this way. Do you believe that he's doing and his administration are doing what they should to protect the Amazon?
I think more can be done, certainly. I think there are threats. I would agree with Dr. Duvall on that, and there's been some scaling back. I think Minister Teresa Cristina is in a pivotal position right now. Under her ministry, there will be the climate change agenda. Brazil is sitting on these billions of tons of emissions reductions that have never been monetized. I think just sending the signal that some of those emissions reductions are going to be worth something would be hugely, hugely influential right now. And so I feel like Brazil is poised for some positive signals from the United States that what they've done historically is recognized, and we're moving into a new phase that's more about incentives than about punishment.
Sir?
I would not take issue with the comments of my colleagues, and I would particularly recognize the value of Dr. Nexat's comment just now about the potential value of the stored carbon and the avoided emissions. One of the difficulties of trying to value these intact forests is that the benefits, to the extent that they're real, and they are real, are global. But the costs of not developing are often perceived as local.
Sure.
And so the world needs to find better ways to monetize that global value so that some of the benefits flow through to local people and local institutions. If that can be done, you would then create a powerful local incentive not to cut down the forest.
Okay. Part of the reason that I asked that question is because I don't believe that the government there is doing everything they can to protect the Amazon. I also don't have confidence in President Bolsonaro's administration right now, because he's demonstrated very erratic behavior, turning down that money from France, getting into a fight with the French president about comments that were made about the French president's wife. So what leverage do concerned nations have to make sure that the Amazon is protected? Those could be carrots or those could be sticks. So I ask you, in the array of carrots and sticks, what do you recommend? I know you just spoke on the emissions issue. Is there something else?
California Air Resources Board on the 19th of September will vote upon the tropical forest standard under construction for 10 years. It would be a way of recognizing the role of state governments in the Brazilian Amazon and their role in reducing deforestation. That sort of thing will send a very positive signal to those states. They were part of the construction of that standard, and that will make it easier for them to attract investors, including climate finance. So I think there are a lot of things that could happen that, that provide those signals to Brazil that we're moving into an era of collaboration. Agribusiness, Bolsonaro threatened to pull out of Paris. He didn't do it because he heard from his own constituents that that was a bad idea. He was going to eliminate the Ministry of Environment. He didn't do it because its own constituents...
Well, he hasn't done it in year 1, right, or year 2.
I think he's heard very loud and clear, as referred to by Dr. Duvall, that his own constituents are saying, wait a minute, we want the forest agenda intact because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of markets, we're going to lose a lot of investors. So I think that's really the way forward. What could the U.S. government do to create a robust mechanism for compensating emissions reductions? It doesn't seem very viable in the current political environment, but that, in the end, I think is what's going to happen. That is going to grow. There are 30 companies in California right now that want to become climate neutral, and they want tropical forest offsets. Those will be voluntary in the first step. Eventually, we will need regulated markets to give that whole endeavor greater volume and greater scale.
My time is up. I know that she had wanted to make one comment, but...
Just wanted to add one thing. On environmental compensation, which is a key incentive, this is contemplated under Brazil's 2012 Forest Code. It just is lacking in regulation, so it hasn't properly been regulated. So that's one thing that should advance, and collaboration with some moral suasion could go a long way towards getting that done. And secondly, once you do have that mechanism working, a lot of the financial resources could come from a much enlarged Amazon fund. So just to get that point in.
Thank you. Congressman Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for the opportunity. When I was in law school, I had a great professor named Abram Shays. And Abram Shays was one of the best and brightest. He was one of Kennedy's guys in the State Department. And I took a class with him called International Environmental Law. And this is back when we were really worried about the ozone layers at the poles, as we should have been and continue to be worried about it. And anyway, he was just a master professor. And at one point he told this story, and he said there's a person that lives in the Amazon, and this gentleman has a gigantic tree in his front yard, and it's 1,000 years old, and it is hundreds of feet tall, and it is absolutely magnificent. It does everything a tree ought to do for oxygen. So what should that gentleman do as an environmentalist? And, of course, having had him for a couple other classes and knowing that he was a very progressive thinker, we thought, well, preserve the tree. And a couple people, he goes, no, he ought to cut it down and make it into lumber. Because being an environmentalist first means feeding his family. He goes, but of course that's the wrong result. He goes, that's the absolutely wrong result. We ought to pay him for his tree so he doesn't cut down the tree, because we're the ones in the developed world that we've already done so much damage to the environment. We ought to pay him for his tree. And, there's a lot to that, I think. I mean, we should participate in a much stronger way in making sure that this forest doesn't get destroyed, because it does benefit all of us. We don't want to see that magnificent tree cut down. In fact, we don't want to see any of them. I have had the opportunity to go to the Amazon before, and one of the things that's most amazing to me, and I wish young people would understand this, when you have clear cutting, when you have burning, all that is terrible. But the worst terror out there is when they burn the forest to plant cocaine. Because when they do that, oftentimes you get this moss, and this moss doesn't allow the trees to pop through it. We went over and actually stopped in some places where they had grown cocaine 20 years ago, and the forest hadn't popped through yet because of the thickness of the awful moss. It was unbelievable. But anyway, I think what's going on there right now is reprehensible, and we have to have more of a hand in working this out as a global community. Doctor, I'd like to ask you about that. I mean, what about this thought? I mean, Mr. Neff said, Dr. Neff said that, there are these other companies that are involved, and California wants to be, neutral in the sense of its climate impact. I mean, shouldn't we be more aggressive doing this?
Well, certainly, but I think the way that, and I will echo something that, a point that Dr. Neff had made here on a number of occasions, which I think is crucial. The way, I think, to work this issue out, even though what's being done right now by the Bolsonaro administration is reprehensible.
It is reprehensible.
The way to work it out is through collaboration.
Yes.
So it can't be through sort of hand-wringing. It can't be through an approach where, another government, any government, I mean, we saw that backfire greatly with France. It can't be through another government trying to impose its views on a sovereign nation, which is the case of Brazil. So there's great scope right now for collaboration between Brazil and the U.S. And so what I think our role should be is putting pressure so that collaboration actually materializes. That's how I see it.
And I agree. And how do we do that, Mr. Milan? How do we do that?
Well, we need to find better ways of bringing together the long-term interests of the globe, including our own country, and the short-term interests of the developing world countries and the mainly poor people who live in their rural areas. Your story about the tree reminds me of something that happened here in the United States about 10 or 15 years ago. There was a forest researcher who was working in the bristlecone pines up in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, and he drilled a hole in an ancient tree in order to count the tree rings, and his drill bit got stuck. And he asked permission of the forest rangers, which they rather stupidly gave him, and then he cut down the bristlecone pine tree in order to retrieve his drill bit. So he cut down a 4,000-year-old tree in order to retrieve a $20 drill bit. I guess the essence of this is that it isn't just Brazilian farmers who...
Yeah, I agree. That was absolutely the terrible thing to do. But again, I appreciate we do have to be more firm, I believe, and what is happening in the Amazon is reprehensible. And I hope the people that do use drugs also understand the damage they do to the forest. Because I know we just blame farmers, we blame everybody, but it's also people that use cocaine. I mean, I was absolutely shocked when I saw the damage that cocaine has done to the Amazon. And our young people, and maybe not so young people that use cocaine, also are damaging the Amazon, damaging the air that we breathe. Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. We just have a couple of more questions. I'm curious about something. How large is the U.S. business investment in the Amazon? American business people, is it a large portion? Are they very involved? Do we have, I'm trying to get at the fact that maybe through the U.S. business people, we can encourage these people to do some good things.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. Currently the Amazon is seen as one of the most risky investments around, in the Americas at least. And I mentioned the ease of doing business index, but it's more than that. If you do business in the Amazon, there's a good chance that you're going to get attacked. And there's a lot of efforts right now by advocacy campaigners to do that, to create reputational risk for your association with deforestation. And I think that those campaigns have been very important. They brought companies and investors to the table, to accountability. So we have all of these companies and investors ready to do something. And the question is how to create those safe pathways to invest, to partner with those local farm sectors and governments. And so I think the concept of these really safe zones, if you've got a Mato Grosso that's offered to reduce emissions by 4 billion tons by 2030, which is true, announced in Paris, let's rally around that government and those farm sectors and make sure that we have a development model in place for that gigantic state, which is Brazil's biggest soy producer, biggest cattle producer, so that they can win. And that's what's missing right now. We have an environment where the responsible investors and companies back away, and there are plenty of U.S. money and companies working in the Amazon. But right now, it's a sense of how do we do it without getting blasted or without becoming a headline. And so I think we need to make those safe pathways.
Let me just add to that by saying that without the federal government's involvement and without a clear strategy by the federal government that completely goes back on or backtracks on what they've been doing so far, it is very hard to see a scenario like that actually materializing. So the potential is there, but again, I come back to my basic point. You need the political will of the federal government to be able to get these initiatives going.
I would agree with that.
Thank you. My colleague now has a question.
Yeah, I'll ask one more. I mean, there's been a lot of facets or matices put on the idea of solving the asymmetries of what's positive but what's not positive. And Congressman Castro's carrots and sticks was one analogy. You just talked about Mato Grosso, and we talked about some of the asymmetry of a guy makes more money by tearing up the land and deforesting it than he ever would keeping it. So I guess I got to thinking when Ted Yoho mentioned about ag, is there any, let me go back to Mr. Milan's comment here in his testimony that you can't meet the needs of the world's food by continuing to plow up more land. We have to have higher productivity. Is that right?
Sorry, I don't think I said that. If I did, I erred.
Raising the production of existing lands.
Yeah. In other words, we need to raise the production of existing lands a lot.
Right.
And if we do that, we don't need to cut down the forest.
That's what I meant. That's exactly right.
Yes.
And that leads you to things like maybe different crops. You know, when Yoho's talking about how many hectares it takes to make a certain quantity of beef, well, that's a lot less in Mato Grosso. It's a lot less in Oklahoma or Texas than it is in the Amazon. Amazon's a terrible place to grow beef. And there's other crops like that. I can't imagine growing soybeans in the Amazon. But are there other things that can be done in the spirit of positive replacement of opportunity that would be better that we don't know about?
There's tremendous interest in the Amazon today and in the national government for fish, increasing fish production. That is managed wild fisheries of the Amazon floodplain. These are community-based management systems, and fish farming. And so you have a place like Rondônia State is exploding with fish production, and it needs technical support, it needs markets, it needs international markets. But that, for me, is getting back to the traditional cuisine of the Amazon. The Amazonians traditionally eat fish protein, not cattle. I'm sorry?
Pirarucu.
Pirarucu, you can buy in Whole Foods around here.
Looks like a tarpon, tastes like a snapper.
As paiche. So there's all of these amazing recipes, culinary, but just high volumes of high-quality fish. And the great thing is farmers want it, large scale. Soy farmers want it. Small-scale farmers want it. Some indigenous communities are doing fish farming. And it's the sort of thing where you have 20 times more production per hectare than beef. And it's not excluding anyone, it's giving them supplemental income. I think that's an example of the sort of thing that could move forward very rapidly and be a win-win. It's a development agenda.
Great.
A U.S. foreign assistance program which married titling of land for rural farmers, raising productivity of that land through the use of hybrid crops and modern fertilizers and insecticides, could have tremendous relevance to 20 or 30 countries around the world, not just to Brazil. It has enormous potential. And one way or another, something similar to that is going to be done, or else they're going to cut down all the forests.
Just coming back to my point on political will, this is exactly where we can get political will, because these sorts of sustainable fish farming activities and things of that, and other sustainable farming activities that may happen in the Amazon or there are currently happening in the Amazon, would serve towards reducing poverty rates and inequality rates. I mean, we are talking about a region of the country where inequality and poverty are at their highest. These are the most naturally rich in resources states of Brazil, but they're also the most impoverished. So there should be great political will just from that fact alone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here today for this important hearing. I urge my colleagues to remain focused on what is happening in the Amazon. I hope this hearing will be the beginning of an ongoing conversation about how the United States Congress can help preserve the Amazon rainforest for generations to come. I thank the witnesses and all the members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman. That was good.
Good. Is that a freshwater fish?